All right, well, welcome to the session on tenure. We'll go ahead and get started. We've got 4 speakers who will each speak for 15 minutes, and I'm going to hold questions until the end. If you have a really, really urgent clarification question, you can submit it via the Q&A function. And if it seems really important to me, then I'll interrupt and ask the question, but we'll expect that we'll just let them go through their presentations. Then at the end, we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Please go ahead and submit your questions through the Q&A function rather than through the chat function. We'll be able to see them, and then at the end, if you would just note in there whether you'd like to be called on to ask your question or you'd rather me just to read it out, then I'll know. But we'll try to start to have a discussion at the end. There's a slight change in the order. We're going to start first with Ardina's paper, and then followed by Andrew, and then Laura and Naomi. So I will stop sharing. And Ardina?
Thank you, Cheryl. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day and conference. So my name is Ardina. I'm from the University of Michigan, and this paper is joint work with Talib Kilic, Gayatri Kulwal, and Heather Moylan, and we're going to talk about the multidimensionality of land ownership among men and women in Sub-Saharan Africa. Let me put my timer on. One note, I unfortunately have to teach like 40 minutes during this presentation, so I have to head off, but 2 of my co-authors are here, and so if there's any questions, they'll be able to answer, and also you can feel free to email me if there are any questions as well. So let's go delve into the motivation of the paper. This is a session on tenure, security, and land ownership. And land ownership really has the potential to enhance individual well-being through multiple channels. Some of the speakers here are actually talking about these channels as well. To give you an example, it helps increase liquidity through rent and sale, provide access through credit markets when used as collateral, and also enhancing wealth for future generations. Now, there is a gap in the literature, however, that there is lack of representative insights regarding the profiles of the general population of landowners. Research has disproportionately focused on particular definitions of ownership, so reported ownership is one of them, where you ask someone, do you own the land? And they could report yes or no. And documented ownership is another, where the focus is on having a title for the land. These type of measures have excluded concepts of rights and control over land. And we do have research that shows that having one particular right doesn't necessarily mean that you actually have the others as well. So previously, there has been data gaps on these landowners' rights and control at a national level and cross-country level. So it was hard to sort of disentangle what ownership actually means. Because of recent innovations, luckily, we do have this data set now. So the UN EDGE guidelines have issued sort of a document on how to collect asset ownership statistics, and the Living Standard Measurement Study Plus, so LSMS Plus surveys, have been using those guidelines to ask asset ownership questions. And particularly for land, they ask about these rights and control variables. So we'll focus on Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Malawi in our paper over the period of 2016 to 2020, but other countries have continued to be added to the LSMS Plus catalog, and all of these modules are very consistent across countries, which makes this really great for cross-country comparison. So the research question that we have is, what types of land ownership profiles actually emerge in Sub-Saharan Africa when we look at the raw data? And we utilize machine learning algorithms to suggest a new way to profile landowners. once these profiles exist, it would be easy to look at different countries and make comparison on how the land ownership institutions might affect certain things. A brief institutional background on these countries. So we have to emphasize that, of course, each of these countries have various institutional background in terms of ownership itself. Just to give you an example, Ethiopia is one of the 3 countries that do not allow a person to sell their land, at least officially. And Ethiopia is also very unique because it has a large land certification program. So you will see in the data that document ownership is actually very high compared to the others. So all 3 countries have a very different landscape of land ownership. Now, despite that, there is a common struggle in these countries, and it's a common struggle of integrating contemporary statutory law with customary law. So an example of this would be in Malawi, where statutory law emphasizes and promotes equal inheritance to both genders. But then if you look at the customary law, they have a matrilineal and patrilineal tenure system that sort of determines how inheritance is done. So because of this contention, it is important to really dig into the data to see what does rights and controls look like in these 3 different countries. So that everyone is in the same page, I wanted to show you what the dimensions of ownership in the LSMS Plus looks like. So we do have 5 different types of rights over land. So the rights to sell, the right to bequeath, the right to use the land as collateral, rent, and also the right to improve or invest on the land. And we also have additional ownership variables such as documented right ownership, economic ownership. So economic ownership is when the individual can decide how the money is used if the plot was sold today. We also have plot decision-making, which means that you are the decision maker in terms of timing of crop activities, crop choice, and input use. Okay. Who are the landowners in our sample? So landowners are a very, very selective group of individuals. And when I talk about land in this presentation, what I mean is non-residential land or mostly agricultural land. They are a selective group of people who own this land, probably about 30% in each country. And in our paper, we also distinguish between reported ownership versus exclusive and joint ownership. And it'll come back later why we do it this way. So even across countries, even if you know what the reported ownership is, there is still difference in terms of whether most of that is exclusive or joint or sort of kind of a flip. So you can see Ethiopia mostly are joint, but that's a very different landscape in Malawi. We can also see the gender differences in landowners. Ethiopia and Malawi, there's a bit more of a gender difference there, though, while Tanzania does not have that difference. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. Okay, so our study is going to focus only on landowners. So let's just look at the data and see who has certain rights and control over land. So being an owner does not necessarily entitle the individual to having all the rights. As you can see here, Ethiopia, even in Ethiopia, you do see a percentage of individuals who don't have certain rights, but as you can see, it's all pretty high. But in Tanzania and Malawi, there are certain rights for sure where people hold less of it. So bequeath, for example, is much less than plot decision-making or economic ownership. And for women especially, it's much, much less. So in Tanzania and Malawi, the gender gaps for certain rights are much higher than gaps in land ownership. So this is interesting. If you remember in the previous slide, I show you that in Tanzania, the gender gap in ownership is actually not that much. But here, once we kind of look into the details of rights and control, it's still much less for women. And that is also the case in Malawi. I'm showing this last graph or this bottom graph over here to show you that approximately 50% of landowners in Tanzania and Malawi have all 5 rights, while it's 72% in Ethiopia. So a majority, at least in Tanzania and Malawi, do not hold certain types of rights or other variables on their land. On to methodology. We're going to use some unsupervised machine learning techniques on this. So one of them is multiple correspondent analysis. It's a dimensionality reduction technique similar to principal component analysis, if you heard that before. PCA is more commonly used in economic papers. But the goal of this multiple correspondent analysis is really trying to analyze which variables can distinguish ownership type. Is there something that really differentiates them, one group of ownership versus another group of ownership, right? And then we also do a clustering algorithm as well. So we're going to use hierarchical clustering. And this is really so that we can group those that are very similar to each other. Okay, and unfortunately, I don't have too much time to delve into this, but feel free to look at the paper on how we do this. I will give you a little bit of a preview or a taste of what the algorithm does. So this is called a biplot, and this is an MCA result for Malawi. We gave in all of those dimensions to the algorithm, and it tells us sort of which variables contribute to most to a particular dimension. And here we're looking at the first 2 dimensions over here. So I want to put your attention to the second graph. You see already that there are clusters of variables that are together, right? So what this usually means is that first, these differentiate landowners much more. And typically, if you have one, you tend to have another one that's very close to it. So you can see that sort of here as well. So economic and plot decision maker doesn't seem to differentiate ownerships by much, but the rent, sell, bequeath, and collateral does. And then over here, you can also see that when we look at levels, so the levels here is joint and exclusive for each of the variables, you also see clusters starting to form over there. And these clusters are quite consistent across countries, which is why we end up choosing the algorithm that we did. And this is just to give you an idea of how much variation is in that first 2 dimensions. And I'll show you the one for Tanzania as well. So we did do a couple of robustness checks and try different types of data that we feed into the algorithm. But in the end, when you look at jointness and exclusiveness of all these rights, these are the ones that are giving us consistent profiles across countries. Okay, so the main result of that exercise is we found that transfer rights are actually very important in creating cluster categories, right? Over here, I actually showed just sort of a robustness check when we use all the ownership variables that we have versus just using transfer rights. You can get the same exact profiles of landowners. So the algorithm is distinguishing these owners into 3 groups, and it doesn't matter if you just use the rights variables or everything. So it shows you how important these transfer rights variables are. And there's other robustness checks that we did also in the paper to show that, oh, it is really transfer rights that are driving these differences. And this is what the cluster categories actually look like. So we have those who are landowners, but who have exclusive transfer rights, joint transfer rights, and do not hold any of the transfer rights. So remember, these who do not hold any of the transfer rights still claim that they are landowners and also likely have the other type of either rights or plot decision-making or economic ownership as well. And in the not hold portion, at least in Malawi and Tanzania, you do see that a majority of those tend to be women compared to male. And in Malawi, it's also interesting because you can look at how the profiles of ownership differ between matrilineal and patrilineal region. Even though in matrilineal you have more women who are owners, there is still a proportion of those women who actually do not hold these transfer rights as well. Okay, so I do only have 2 minutes. I'm going to try to wrap this up a little bit. Once we have these profiles, there's other topics concerning land ownerships that we are able to explore. So one of them, for example, is looking at cluster rigidity. You can kind of see how rigid certain bundles are in different countries. To give you an example, joint ownership in Malawi and Tanzania, if you're in this cluster of joint transfer rights, there's less rigidity here compared to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, once you have joint ownership of transfers, you pretty much always have joint for all, but that's not the case for Malawi and Tanzania. So even the structures or these bundles are sometimes differ by cluster as well. Another thing that we could explore is trying to look at land users versus land owners. In two of our countries, Ethiopia and Tanzania, we actually have data on people who say they use the land but are not the owners. And if we feed it again to the algorithm, how do they look in compared to actual owners? And I don't have too much time to delve into this, but again, the joint ownership is the one that sort of pops out. Like there are differences in the structures in joint ownership. So to conclude, these techniques such as MCA and clustering are very useful in understanding the bundles of rights that landowners have. Transfer rights is key. So if you are creating a survey and you only have transfer rights, you actually don't lose much information. And if you have just one transfer rights, you also don't lose too much information. And once these categories are established, you can do further exploratory data analysis that really reveal patterns across genders and countries in terms of the bundles. Thank you very much. I think I'm over by 30 seconds. Sorry.
Great, thank you, Ardina. So we're going to take questions all at the end. So we will move next to Andrew.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay and see the slides? Perfect. So thanks so much. Today, I'm going to share new evidence on the investment impacts of land demarcation from a willingness to pay experiment in Mozambique. This is joint work together with several of my colleagues at the World Bank's Africa Gender Innovation Lab, Claire Boxo, Marcus Goldstein, Joao Montalvão, and Mike O'Sullivan. Oops. There we go. While the share of the population in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is falling, the sector remains a key driver of rural economies throughout the region. Despite this, the sector continues to be characterized by limited investment and low productivity. Economic theory suggests that insecure property rights may be one barrier to agricultural investment for smallholder farmers. Specifically, farmers may be reluctant or unable to invest due to either the risk of expropriation and the possibility of losing their investment, or the inability to use their land as collateral to support a loan to finance agricultural investments. There is a growing body of evidence documenting a positive relationship between property rights and investment, including farmers planting trees on their more secure fields, leaving their more secure land fallow for a longer duration, or better preserving soil nutrients. Despite this growing literature, there remains relatively limited experimental evidence on the impacts of boosting property rights. Additionally, there's relatively limited evidence on land formalization efforts in matrilineal contexts. Several existing studies have focused on efforts to boost women's land tenure security in patrilineal contexts through, for example, co-titling, but better understanding the relationship between land formalization, investment, and marriage regimes will be important, particularly as broad-based land formalization efforts expand in the region. We examined these questions by partnering with an international NGO implementing a sustainable agriculture program for smallholder farmers in Mozambique. we focus on two components of their project: conditional land titles and input subsidies. As you'll see in a minute, we use the demarcation under the conditional land titles as an exogenous shock to land tenure security before offering the subsidized input bundle through a willingness to pay experiment to measure the impacts of the demarcation. I'll talk a little bit about each of these components before going over how they fit into the experimental design. The conditional land titling component sought to address potential land tenure security constraints facing program participants in the sustainable agriculture program. For selected households, the program offered to formally demarcate one plot of land and submit the required documentation to register a government-issued land title. This is called a DUAT in Mozambique. The offer was conditional on including the head woman's name on the title, either the household head, if it was a woman, or the household head spouse. It also was only, sorry, my dog just walked into the room. It was also only eligible for the largest plot of land, which we identified using the baseline data. Notably, all land in Mozambique is owned by the state and is not collateralizable, limiting the potential mechanisms through which this component can impact investment. Basically shutting off the access to finance constraint because they can't take their land to a financial institution to use it as collateral. For the land titling component, we randomized 534 women in rural landowning households into either a treatment group that received a condition or an offer to conditionally demarcate their land in support of the land use permit, or a control group that did not receive the offer. The sample was drawn from the set of program participants and was balanced across a range of individual and household characteristics. To give you a general sense, these are broadly representative of women in the region. The only eligibility requirement that was imposed by the program was that the household owned land, and in practice, this was not a particularly binding constraint. This is noticeable or notable given the earlier presentation that noted that only around 30% of individuals in the countries they looked at owned land. That was really not a binding constraint here. A few key characteristics: 88% of our sample is married, and 70% are married in matrilineal marriages. On average, our sample farms a little over 2.5 hectares on slightly fewer than 2 plots. Our data suggests that customary land rates are a multidimensional concept, exactly in line with the paper just presented. 40% of women indicate that they own the largest plot by themselves. 32% indicate that they manage the largest plot by themselves, and 24% indicate that they alone have transfer rights over that plot. And we'll come back to this a little later as well. Following the land demarcation, our NGO partner revisited each of the sample households for a willingness to pay experiment that comprised a take it or leave it offer for a subsidized agricultural bundle. So this offer was made to the head woman in the household. Again, that's either the head of the household, if it's a woman, or the head of the household spouse. The program extensionists first described the bundle, which had a market value of around $330 and included maize and sugar bean seed to cover about 1/4 hectare each, cassava and sweet potato cuttings, fruit tree seedlings, and then complementary agricultural inputs, so fertilizer, insecticide, herbicide, and fungicide. You can think about the first and the last of each of these as comprising the bulk of the value of this input bundle. The bundle offer was framed around that woman. It was an opportunity for her to buy and use agricultural inputs, though there was no requirement or following up to see how they actually used it. Women received a take it or leave it offer where they were randomly assigned a price corresponding to one of 4 discount levels. So either 87% of the value of the bundle, 79%, 71%, or 63%. And these are discount rates. So they either pay 13% of the value of the bundle up to 37%. We detailed to the participants that they would not need to pay anything when they made their decision. This was to try and avoid short-term liquidity constraints. Half would be due with the first delivery and half with the second delivery, so the maize and then the sugar bean seeds. We described that they would receive one opportunity to buy the bundle at the discounted rate. There was no negotiation, and they would not have the opportunity to change their mind. This is really key in contexts where negotiation is kind of a common aspect of market transactions. So after confirming whether they understood the offer that we were presenting, we revealed the price that they could purchase the bundle at and asked if they wanted to buy the bundle. Women who accepted received a receipt indicating their price and their decision. This decision, whether to accept the offer, represents our main outcome. Specifically, using an intent to treat design, we examine whether receiving the land demarcation offer increased the likelihood of accepting the investment offer. That is, did the land demarcation in support of formal land use documentation boost their willingness to invest? Before we get into the top line results, I want to make a quick note on compliance and land titling implementation. Overall, interest in the land use permits was high. Over 92% of the households assigned to receive the permit offer went through with the demarcation. This suggests that the conditionality was not really a significant deterrent for these households. In terms of satisfying this conditionality, households could have used one of two approaches. They could either register the plot in the woman's name only, or they could co-title, including the woman's name together with a man's, any other household member's name. 38% of the households in our sample ultimately decided to solo title. Notably, this is slightly less than the fraction that solo titled in a patrilineal context in Uganda. So it seems like they maybe were slightly more willing, to co-title. And I'm not going to, I don't think we can talk about what the implications for kind of rights over land. Here, we find only a limited set of variables that were correlated with this decision. That pre-program reported land rights that solo titling increased in women's customary land rights and that it decreased in their marriage status, with neither matrilineal marriage or perceived tenure security driving this decision. In terms of our results, overall, we find that the program did not shift investment patterns in aggregate. Land demarcation households were only around 2 to 3 percentage points more likely to invest, but this is not statistically significant. And each of these columns just represents slightly different specifications. However, theory suggests that there are several potential drivers of heterogeneity. First, if land tenure security was holding back investment, we might expect larger impacts to accrue to households with less secure rights. Second, in other contexts, we may expect that the intervention may be particularly impactful for credit-constrained households by facilitating these market transactions. Third, the conditionality may have increased women's intra-household bargaining, which would lead to larger impacts potentially accruing to individuals with lower pre-programmed decision-making. And finally, impacts may also depend on whether the formalization reinforces pre-programmed customary land rights or whether it attempts to shift this intra-household ownership. And that is whether that conditionality within the household is really binding. So we examine each of these on their own and together, finding that it's this last one, the customary ownership, that is really key in driving investment decisions. Women who report higher pre-programmed land rights are significantly more likely to accept the offer, while those with lower pre-programmed land rights see a statistically insignificant decrease. How did we do this? recognizing that customary land rights are a multidimensional concept, we constructed an index based on the extent to which women report ownership, management, and transfer rights over the plot. In column 2 here, we split that based on the median into households where the woman has high pre-programmed land rights and women who have low pre-programmed land rights. We see that on average, those with high land rights are less likely to accept the program or less likely to accept the investment offer. But that land demarcation for these households significantly increases their likelihood of accepting, and it basically offsets their decreased likelihood of accepting without the program. And that's kind of the 19 plus the -5 offsets that high land rights of around -15 percentage points. Similarly, in columns 3 and 4, we use the continuous index underlying this high-low land right split, which makes use of all of the information contained in kind of the ownership, management, and transfer rights, and should boost our power a little. So we see that this actually does yield a slightly stronger pattern of results, with a 1 standard deviation increase in land rights for demarcated households, yielding a 13 percentage point increase in the likelihood of buying the bundle. While column 4 shows that our results do not stem from high land right widows, but rather from high land rights married couples, suggesting that there may be intra-household tenure insecurity as opposed to broader based community sources of land tenure insecurity. So I'll wrap up here. We find that investment impacts of demarcation activities depend critically on pre-programmed customary rights. Investment increases when registration formalizes customary rights, and it may decrease when, registration necessitates an intra-household transfer. What's driving this pattern of results? Ultimately, we can't really say with the data that we have. We have a couple hypotheses, and we just wrapped up a midline survey to look at this in a little more detail. We know that it's not using credit constraints, as land isn't collateralizable in this context. It could be that increased tenure security is manifesting differently in these two different types of households. That increased investment in households where it reinforces customary ownership, while decreased guard labor in households where the conditional offer necessitates a transfer of land rights. Additionally, it's possible that the mandated intra-household transfer led to a shift in intra-household land tenure and security, which could be driving this as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And we will next turn to Laura. And again, we'll do all the Q&A at the end, but feel free to go ahead and start putting questions in the Q&A spot if you'd like. So.
Okay, let me just get my timer going. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be presenting this work on customary tenure and agricultural investment in Uganda. This is relatively early stages work, so I would really appreciate any comments or suggestions that you have on this. So both Ardina and Andrew set up the motivation for this paper really nicely. Essentially starting from this longstanding theoretical point in economics that secure land tenure should allow farmers to make long-term investments in agricultural productivity. They're going to realize the gains from those long-term investments in the future, so they're more likely to make it. However, the empirical effects of documentation or formalization programs that have aimed to make land tenure more secure in Sub-Saharan Africa has been quite mixed in terms of the empirical evidence. So there's a lot of suggestions as to why this might be. It might be that customary land is not perceived by farmers as less secure, or there could be other kinds of constraints, as Andrew was hinting at the end there, for why documentation might not unlock this kind of investment. In this paper, however, I'm going to be talking about what Ardina was was emphasizing that the distribution of rights really matters. And in customary tenure, rights are distributed amongst multiple people. And I'm going to be looking at how this can influence perceived security of tenure. So I'm going to have a theoretical model that looks at agricultural investment and incorporates the social dynamics of land rights. So that rights are held by multiple people in a community, and then looking at how farmers respond to changing land pressures under different tenure regimes. So in the model, I have a liquidity constraint. So as land values in an area increase, liquidity constraints should relax. Farmers should be able to invest more on their land. However, those higher land values can also lead local elites to have more incentive to expropriate customary land in order to sell it to those outsiders for higher values, which could actually reduce the tenure security and therefore investment on customary parcels. And then I'm going to empirically test the predictions of this model using data from Uganda and looking to see if there are heterogeneous responses to rising land pressures between customary and freehold land for various kinds of investments. So I don't have a ton of time, so just to preview the results quickly, I find indeed that long-term input use does respond to rising land values much more strongly on freehold land than it does on customary land. I argue that this is because of these elite incentives to expropriate customary land also rising along with the land value, creating tenure insecurity on customary land where it might not have existed before, and therefore attenuating the impacts of increased liquidity. I find a much smaller divergence in short-term inputs, although the model would predict no divergence. I'm going to argue that this is perhaps due to some preliminary evidence that I see about changing cropping patterns. So this paper sort of contributes to two big literatures. First of all, in the model, I'm very careful throughout to distinguish between the incompleteness of rights from the insecurity. And I think this is a really important dimension to be considering, as Ardina emphasized. So thinking carefully about how multiple rights holders are going to interact in different environments and what that can imply for agricultural investment. Throughout, I am careful to distinguish between tenure security, so the likelihood that you're going to keep your land in the future, from tenure type. And this is going to link the model and the empirics quite closely. A lot of work has sort of said, in the model, we're thinking about tenure and security, but then used tenure type, customary tenure, as a rough proxy for that. I'm also going to speak to a literature on elite capture and thinking carefully about how the potential for elite capture can affect individual farmers. So bringing that focus to smallholder welfare, but also, even if elite capture is relatively rare, it can have effects on a more numerous population because of worries about this, and I'm able to quantitatively document that. So the context in Uganda is quite important. Only between 2 to 10% of land on the continent is formally titled. In Uganda, that average is about 12%, but there is a substantial amount of regional variation. Now, sort of broad strokes, the way these rights are assigned, use rights are often assigned at a household level. And there has been some work documenting that these use rights might be secure for a farmer's lifetime and therefore sufficient for long-term investments. However, transfer rights are traditionally, in a lot of customary tenure systems, assigned at a higher level. So you could think about lineage elders, clan leaders, chiefs that hold these transfer rights. Now, if we're thinking about that from a perspective of Western freehold tenure, there's an institutional mismatch. If you are coming in from the city and looking to buy land, who do you buy it from? Who is the owner to buy that land from? This institutional mismatch, this ambiguity, can be exploited by elites, especially in cases where there is demand for land from outsiders. Throughout Uganda, you see a lot of signs like this that say property not for sale, which is really an attempt to try and make these use rights legible to outsiders, to make it clear that the rights are being held at a lower level. So really briefly going through the model, it's a 2-period model where farmers are choosing to invest in a short-term input, fertilizer, and a long-term input, which I'm going to call trees for the purposes of the model. Which are a common long-term investment in Uganda. So farmers are going to have a wealth endowment. They can additionally borrow against the value of their land, but I'm going to focus on the case where the liquidity constraint does bind for these farmers. Now, they also face some probability that their land will be expropriated before the second period. Now, this expropriation could take two forms. It could be horizontal expropriation by the community, by community members. So you could think about this as border disputes or disputes within the community, as well as this vertical expropriation by elites that I'm going to focus on, where elites are selling the land to someone else without the permission of the land users. For simplicity today, I'm going to assume that freehold land is never expropriated, although that can be relaxed, obviously. So because this liquidity constraint binds, we're measuring fertilizer from the left-hand axis here and trees from the right-hand axis. Because the liquidity constraint binds, farmers are unable to invest at the optimal level where the marginal benefits are equal to the cost of the inputs. And instead, they're going to be investing at point A, where the marginal benefits between short-term fertilizer inputs and long-term inputs are equal. As land values increase, farmers are able to borrow more against the value of their land, increasing the liquidity that they have in order to invest with. So that's going to open up the space that farmers can use to invest, and they're going to shift their investment from point A to point A prime, which is closer to the optimal levels. Now, in a low land value environment, thinking about the differences between freehold and customary land, there is on customary land some probability that the land is going to get expropriated before the second period, which is going to lower the returns to long-term inputs. So the returns to trees are going to decrease from tau to, say, tau double prime. If we're thinking about horizontal expropriation, so border disputes, some long-term inputs such as trees can actually do some can have some security enhancing effects. So perhaps more at like tau triple prime, but regardless, the marginal benefits to long-term inputs are going to be lower on customary land than they are on freehold. So we would expect to see weekly lower investment in long-term inputs on customary land. As we think about what's happening on customary land, as we look at a higher land value environment, however, we're going to see that these increasing land values not only relax the liquidity constraint, but they actually also increase the incentives for elites to expropriate customary land, and therefore increase the probability that the farmer loses customary land before that second period. So we're going to see much lower returns to long-term inputs on customary land as land values increase. So we're actually going to see a reduction, perhaps, and certainly not as large of an increase in investment in long-term inputs on customary land as we look at higher land value environments. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of the model. I'm unable to exactly test the model because I can't look over time, but I'm going to test some of these predictions using baseline data survey data from the baseline survey for an impact evaluation of Uganda's agriculture cluster development project that I conducted. So we interviewed 2,189 households across 4 different districts throughout Uganda, spread throughout the country. These households are members of farmer organizations, which I am going to use. These are self-selected farmer groups. Throughout the survey, we do really careful plot level elicitation of all inputs and outputs, as well as continuous measures of investment that I'm going to use, and tenure status of each plot. And then we ask farmers about land rental prices, both for their own land as well as in the area, and capture GPS coordinates for the house. So this is going to give me a panel or a 5,760 parcel season observations. So in this one survey, we ask over 2 seasons, so basically a year in Uganda. I'm going to also use data from the global grid of probabilities of urban expansion, which is 2.5 arc minute, so roughly 5 kilometers at the equator where Uganda is, grid cells. Within each, this gives the estimated probability that that cell will become urban by the year 2030 using a population density driver map. So this is capturing these external pressures on land values, not things like agricultural productivity. And it is correlated with median reported rental prices in the area. So the model predicts that in the regressions in the empirical strategy that I'm running, that investment in long-term inputs should be weekly lower on customary land. We should also expect to see rising investment with land values on freehold land for both long-term and short-term inputs, but that effect for long-term inputs should be attenuated on customary land due to elite expropriation incentives. Now, we should be thinking about this not as a causal empirical strategy, but instead as being consistent with the theory. However, some sort of things that make me a little bit more confident in this, Deininger and Ali argue that land rights in Uganda are basically historically and exogenously determined and haven't really been changed very much over the past few decades. Ideally, I would be using a household fixed effects model. However, in this survey, I actually don't find nearly as many households as in, say, the LSMS data that have both parcels under freehold and customary land. So for now, I'm going to use farmer group fixed effects. Because these farmer groups are self-selected, we would expect members of a farmer group to share unobservables, but I'm able to get that leverage. And then I'm going to use both in terms of thinking about land values, I'm going to use both reported rental values and sort of a coarse probability of urbanization. I am definitely running out of time, but I see that indeed the disparities do increase with rental values. So in this light blue line that's sloping down, that's looking at insecurity. So we can see that at low rental prices, tenure insecurity does not actually differ very much between freehold and customary land. So the y-axis here is the difference between freehold and customary land. This diverges as land values increase. So customary land becomes reportedly much less secure in higher land value environments. In the model, I would predict that there's no difference in short-term inputs, such as inorganic fertilizer. That's the sort of bold blue line here. I do find a slight difference as a slight divergence as land prices increase, but it's much shallower than the slope, the divergence for trees, this much longer term input that we can see in black here. A similar pattern holds with urbanization, the probability of urbanization, again, with trees being much steeper than the shorter term inputs. In terms of the regression results, I find broadly consistent, I don't have time to go through all of these, broadly consistent results where insecurity increases along with rental prices on customary land, but not for freehold land. For long-term inputs, I find that as rental prices or as land values increase on freehold land, tree planting, this long-term investment, increases quite substantially. Effects are much smaller on customary land, even perhaps negative, depending on the specification. For short-term inputs such as inorganic fertilizer, I find smaller differences between customary and freehold land in response to these increasing land values. So in the last 30 seconds, in this paper, I've looked at a theoretical model for how expropriation incentives change as land pressures increase. So local elites are observing outsiders' demand for land and those outsiders' inability to distinguish between the overlapping customary rights. This elite expropriation, even if it's uncommon in practice, smallholder farmers can be afraid of it, and that can reduce perceived tenure security. So the model then predicts that long-term input use will diverge between customary and freehold parcels as land pressures increase. And I find evidence consistent with that model in Uganda. This goes beyond just saying that customary land is less secure and instead thinks carefully about the interacting incentives of multiple stakeholders. So that's my 15 minutes. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you, Laura. And we'll go to our last paper. So Naomi. Courtney, is that you with your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Cheryl. My question's for Laura. I've done a bit of work in Uganda, and I know that kind of writ large, there's very little usage of credit for short-term inputs like fertilizer. I'm just wondering if the ACDP data that you had, if you asked about loans like that, or if you have any evidence from that you could share with us.
Yeah, so we do ask about credit usage. We also find pretty low levels of even like applying for credit in this sample. The model, like thinking about expanding the liquidity constraint through a credit channel, is sort of for simplicity of the math. There are other channels by which rising land values can lead to that investment, even if it isn't credit, but it gets a little bit more complicated to communicate in a couple of minutes, that model. But yeah, in the ACDP data, we do ask about credit usage and find really low levels. ACDP as a program was aimed to improve usage of these inputs. It was subsidized inputs. The impact assessment kind of fell apart, and so we don't actually have follow-up data from it because we had quite low take-up, even at 90% subsidy levels, on the order of 20% take-up, and then our control group also had quite a bit of take-up. So the impact assessment fell apart, and so I won't be using later rounds of that data. I'm hoping to use other data sources such as the LSMS data. I think probably has better coverage that would be useful in terms of actually answering these questions a little better.
So I don't see anybody else's hand up, so I'm going to ask a question, which is that a couple of you, I know Andrew talked about this mechanism as well as having land titling, meaning that you can then use the land for collateral. Although my sense is that in many cases, and this is probably true, Naomi and I have talked about this, right, that in her case, it's not clear that the bank, right, we think of collateral as that the bank can take over the land if you don't pay back your loan. And I think there's a lot of these contexts in which that's not actually the case, even if you have a title for it. The mechanism isn't that the bank is going to be able to repossess your land. But it seems like there's still a reason why you might have access to better credit if you have a title, even without that, right? That if you're a landowner, you're seen as somebody with more status in the community, more things to lose, right? You've got better tenure security, right? You're much more likely to not have somebody take away your crops or your land with the crops on them than somebody else. And so it seems like there's still a mechanism in which the land titling might matter for credit, even if it's not through kind of formal collateralization. So Andrew, I don't know if you want to respond or if anybody else does. Laura, you are welcome to as well.
I have just I think that's super interesting. And I think it's really interesting to think about how that would then interact with the shift from more kind of ad hoc or sporadic land titling efforts to more systematic land titling efforts, right? The mechanism that you described, I think, is kind of relying on that ad hoc nature to distinguish between higher and lower risk potential borrowers. But for example, we're another kind of sibling study to the one I presented today is looking at the rollout of systematic land registration in Mozambique through the Mozland project, which aims to cover millions of households across thousands of communities. And I think it would be really interesting to see whether that mechanism you're talking about changes or is less applicable in contexts where there is systematic land registration as opposed to the more ad hoc approaches. But I completely agree. I think it's really interesting.
So then you would be distinguishing between whether having land somehow makes you a better credit risk, even if you can't, if the bank can't claim it, versus that there's some kind of a selection that only certain kinds of people, better credit risks, are the ones who acquire land. Right. So that'd be really interesting. Laura, did you want to say something?
Well, I think like with the digital finance explosion, there is also this just like information, I think, and part of it is self-selection, as you say, but part of it is being able to locate people, even if you're not going to repossess the land, but in low credit information systems, any information can help banks. So yeah, I think that this is actually a really interesting point, although I think Andrew's point about how much information is contained in that title and whether it's self-selection is also a super interesting one.
Great. Anyone else?
I think there's a hand up from Carol again.
Is that a new hand, Carol, or the same hand?
Yes, a new one. Thank you. I was wondering about the context of Laura's paper in Uganda about these outsiders creating the land pressure. So I'm just wondering, maybe I missed this. What is the potential use of land by these outsiders? I guess it depends whether the village is close to the city or otherwise. What is happening with this land if it is, you know, captured by the, I don't know, outsiders or elites?
I think that's a really important question. And I think the use of, I am primarily thinking about near urban areas. These are rural areas that are not so far from the city, is the land pressure that I'm capturing here. So some of it is speculation that the city is going to expand to this area and that land is going to become quite valuable. There's also a lot of demand from urbanites in Uganda who maybe are from more remote areas. Their village, their ancestral village is more remote, to have land that's more accessible to the city that they are going to use agriculturally, perhaps, you know, hiring people to do the farming, but to have sort of a farm that they can go to on the weekends. Getting out of Kampala on Friday afternoons is a bit of a nightmare. So I think there's demand for agricultural land to remain agricultural, but to be that people living in the city want this. So I think, but there's also definitely a lot of speculation, especially along the rural corridor between Kampala and Entebbe. There's a lot of speculation, land speculation happening there and elsewhere. And in the north, there's speculation about perhaps oil rights on the land. So it's sort of a hodgepodge in different areas with a lot of different incentives that these outsiders.
So I see. And so the people, so kind of ignoring the speculation, the people that come from the city with capital, that use the land still for agriculture, I assume they would be investing heavily on this land too, no?
Perhaps. Probably. Yeah, I would say that they probably are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, if no one else has a question, then we will, oh, Doug, you have a question, go ahead.
This is a question for Andrew, and I probably just missed this in the course of things, but the bundle of inputs that people are receiving, how much of that is focused on short-term productivity, and how much can you really identify that is making longer-term investments of the kind that you expect to see going along with tenure security, and how do you understand the difference there?
So this is, we spent quite a bit of time with the NGO that was implementing this to really try and ensure that they were very eager to have it focused on short-term inputs. That's why I think the bulk of the value of the bundle was really in the maize and the sugar bean seeds. There were, so some of the other ingredient or some of the other components that were included like tree saplings for fruit trees, as well as some other slightly longer term or slower developing crops. And I'm blanking specifically what those were, but there were some that kind of had 2 to 3 year growth periods. But I'm sympathetic to that. I do think it's really, even if it's not the long-term investment, it is still kind of a short-term investment in their agricultural productivity. This is a significant kind of investment in terms of even just improved quality seeds, where very few of these, I think it's somewhere around 9 or 10% of these households were using improved seeds before, in the absence of the investment bundle.
It's really interesting, thanks. And it does suggest that maybe even in the short term, there are some security issues about pilferage or something. It's just intriguing. It's an intriguing result. Thanks.
And we actually, so ultimately we we conducted the willingness to pay, but we're interested in the impacts of the bundle itself. So we actually went back a few weeks later and decided to give it to everyone, regardless of whether or not they decided to buy it. Accepted the purchase offer, I should say.
Good. Last call for questions. Good. Well, thank you all again. This was really, really an interesting session. And I'll look forward to seeing where this all goes.